Hello, I'm George Liston, CA, and this is Dialogue, a weekly exploration into the world of international affairs, history, and culture. We are not alone. The enormity of the attacks of September 2001 marked a brutal passage for America into the world of massive terrorist atrocity. But terrorism has long been a menace to civilization, and it has brought tragedy, pain, and loss to many lands. If we're not to suffer a fate where mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, then the hard-won wisdom of those who have long dealt with terrorism and the cooperative action of the world community will be called upon as never before in our common history. My guest is Fernando Reinares, professor and chair of political science at King Juan Carlos University in Madrid. Fernando, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
It's my pleasure indeed, too. I must say that, as you know, 9/11 is a powerful symbol in this country, but 3/11 is a powerful symbol in Spain, the events of March 11th, the terrorist bombings of the train. And I guess the first question, Fernando, has to do with just what kind of symbol it is. Many in Spain and here thought it was directly tied to the Spanish presence in Iraq. But is it your position that it has a longer-standing linkage to a European context?
March 11th was probably done because of the opportunity offered, the visibility offered by the Iraq War. The terrorists probably wanted to intervene and manipulate the political debate and polarize positions in Spain and the whole of Europe on Iraq. However, the decision to target Spain, I don't think was taken because of the Spanish participation in the Iraqi war. The decision, in my opinion, was taken at the end of the year 2001 or early 2002. And why? Because in Spain, as a result of September 11th, the judicial authorities and the police started an operation which ended up dismantling the Al-Qaeda cells and the structure that existed in the country and was indeed used by Mohammed Atta, Gramsci Benashvili, and other people implicated in the September 11th attacks. It is, in my opinion, that moment when Al-Qaeda revolted against Spain, although the actual materialization of this hostility took place on March 11th, but the group who committed those atrocities, that massacre, actually started to be articulated 2.5 years before.
And that's all your points are absolutely important and excellent, Fernando. And the fact that the event was so long in planning, more than 2 years by your estimate, obviously suggests a very strong European presence for Al-Qaeda. And I guess that's the next question, Fernando. How has Al-Qaeda acted in Europe? I mean, how does it operate? I have the sense, just myself, of a global organization that is, very skilled at using different groups and places. But in the European context, how do they accomplish that, and who do they draw upon? Where do they get their people?
Okay, in the European countries, for years, not particular over the 90s, you have these subcultures of violence created in sometimes and often around worship places or mosques where Wahhabi preachers were justifying violence against what they call infidels. This is part of the Salafi thinking. They added to this the idea that the Holy War is something to be understood not as an internal struggle with oneself so as to become a better person, but as an actual offensive, even if portraying defense of Islam against infidels or against those who do not follow the Sharia.
So this radical clergy then sort of inspires the people to think of this as a religious act.
Yes, and it is, once you establish this subculture, it became easy for Al-Qaeda to penetrate Islamic communities and recruit people which in Europe, sometimes second-generation immigrants, might be the case in countries where Muslim immigration has a long tradition, like the United Kingdom or France, for instance, or Belgium. In other countries such as Spain, for instance, those who perpetrated the March 11 attacks were first-generation immigrants coming from Morocco, coming from Maghreb. This is the area where the main threat comes from.
This is excellent, Fernando. You know, when you think of this kind of activity, and as you express here, the fact that it can have such broad appeal among diverse groups, the question then becomes, what do terrorists seek to achieve? You devoted a lot of attention to this. I mean, and I know it's a very complex subject, and I know that one of the things that you think is essential is we have to understand the historical and cultural context in which they operate. But what do they want? I mean, what do they want, really?
Ultimately, what they want is what we might refer to as the political unification of the Islamic world, the reconstitution of the caliphatus. In the middle term, they might be looking forward to controlling an state with a population majoritarily Muslim.
Like Afghanistan was.
Like Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia or eventually Iraq.
Right, right. If, you know, we have this situation where they could seek to achieve that degree of political control, it does pose a problem for democracies, doesn't it, in terms of how you combat that? Because, well, I would love to hear your views on that, and particularly the dangers of overreaction to it. I mean, how do you do it?
Well, it is indeed a kind of a zero-sum conflict, because for they to achieve their purposes, they need to erode and eventually destroy the sense of order, the sense of security, and the values and principles and procedures upon our democracies are based.
Right.
Now, it depends on the type and style and module of our reaction. That they might advance their purposes or might be debilitated.
Let me make sure I understand that. If we react in the wrong way, we could actually advance their cause.
If we react in a wrong way, they will gain sympathies, mobilize supporters in the Arab and Islamic world, and therefore guarantee a provision of human and material resources for a long period of time, 10, 20 years. Even if the actual Al-Qaeda structure is debilitated, there will be people following the ideas of Osama bin Laden or Ayman al-Zawahiri, which might eventually decided to constitute cells, autonomous cells, or might join groups, existing armed groups, which are affiliated to Al-Qaeda since the late 90s.
This brings up a number of important questions. Number one, is this largely then a battle for public opinion? I mean, is this one in which the public has to be engaged, both Islamic and non-Islamic?
Absolutely. Not only in this case, the fight against terrorism is always a fight for legitimacy. The terrorists claim to have legitimacy. We claim to have legitimacy. And more often than not, when establishing military measures or police measures or judicial measures against terrorism, we forget that there has to be communicative action, so as to also counter the propaganda that the terrorists, by the way, are very successful in using as a mobilizing tool for their own purposes.
So keeping that communication strong on the democratic side, and I guess from your earlier statement also protecting the civil liberties of a democracy so that we don't end up creating dissatisfaction, are very important points. Fernando, you mentioned something else too I want to focus on. This I think is a very big point. The role of associated groups or support groups. I mean, you've done a lot of work on the size of Al-Qaeda, and of course it's been under attack for years. Is it a large organization still, or is it a smaller one that uses these other organizations to do its work?
Well, Al-Qaeda per se, as the original foundational terrorist structure, is smaller and more debilitated than it was before September 11th. Now, the actual international terrorist network is more diffuse and widespread than it was before September 11th. Those, I mean, the more you debilitate the original structure, the more you find all these groups which compensate and balance the whole constellation of international terrorism nowadays. So the problem is now more fragmented. The phenomenon is more diffuse. It's more perilous also.
Right.
In this
Does that make it more difficult, the fact that it's more diffuse, that it's not set in one place, it's everywhere?
On the one hand, it is more difficult to be treated and for us to establish adequate responses. On the other hand, it's more susceptible to infiltration, but again, it has become a rather diffuse phenomenon,
right?
And lacking hierarchical structure, command structure, a number of self-constituted cells and networks might be there ready to designate targets in accordance
at any time.
What is indicated on the web and become operational without the actual command and support of Al-Qaeda structures.
I guess this suggests the obvious question of how you go about combating something so threatening and so diffuse. And here I want to speak specifically to another thing you've given a lot of attention to, the differences that Europeans and Americans may have in their tactics. To put it in a word or two, one could say the American government has decided on what could obviously be called a very proactive strategy. And some claim that, some Americans in particular, say that Europeans adopt a very reactive strategy to this danger. Do you accept that, or do you think?
No, American administration, the American government is acting on a proactive way in military terms. The Europeans also want to be proactive, but in intelligence terms.
Right.
Both are proactive initiatives. What it seems to be the case is for the U.S. executive power to rely on a counterterrorism model which tends to emphasize unilateral action or quasi-unilateral action, and relying fundamentally or primarily on military means. The Europeans are more keen to cooperation in police and judicial matters and multilateral action. And this basic distinction is what makes the two approaches so different.
That's very helpful. And I guess the obvious question, once again, Fernando, is with these basic directions, if you will, European and American, do you have a sense that cooperation is achieved, or is there dissonance? I mean, I guess the real fundamental issue is, are the Americans and the Europeans successfully combining their focuses on this question?
Well, cooperation between the European Union and the United States is well below the optimum.
Well below the optimal point.
We need to successfully counter the network of international terrorism that we currently face. Certainly we have societies which adopt different perceptions of the threat.
Right.
We have societies which consider different forms of tackling this problem, and then we have political elites which tend to implement different models of counterterrorism. Although there has been exchange between one and the other model. For instance, in the United States, you now have an institution which was traditional one in the European policies, which is the Ministry of the Interior.
That's right. You mean Homeland Security. Right. That's the European model.
And on the other hand, Europeans are also conscious about the scope and dimensions of this international terrorist network, and in the European Constitution have included the so-called solidarity clause, which says literally that in the case of a terrorist attack, member states will provide mutual assistance, also including military means.
You know, when you say that in the event of an attack, forces will be combined and nations will help each other. That, of course, reminds one of NATO. That was the 50-year spirit of European-American cooperation, Fernando. This, you know, it's extremely fascinating to me. And when you mention the fact that America has literally gone to war, as we are at war in Iraq on this question, it reminded me of something I think that you wrote, that first of all, there have been more than 2,000, well over 2,000 terrorist incidents involving American interests or people over the past 20 years. But the American military response to them has been quite rare. But now, of course, in Iraq, it's full scale. And I guess the $64,000 question, as we say here, is, what does that mean? The military presence of America in Iraq, is that, in your opinion, successfully fighting against terrorism, or, as some argue, encouraging more terrorism? What verdict would you put on it?
Unsuccessfully and counterproductive in terms of fighting terrorism. But actually, the war in Iraq is not a war against terrorism. The war in Iraq was justified, at least partially, because of suspected links between Saddam Hussein and September 11th, or the dictatorial regime and the current international terrorist network. There is no evidence of those linkages. The only evidence we have is that Al-Qaeda and in particular the group led by Zarqawi has successfully penetrated into the country, is making profit out of the conflict, not only political profit in terms of the projection in the Arab and Muslim world, but also economic profit, that Iraq is serving as an operational ground where Al-Qaeda is introducing innovations in its repertoire of violence, for instance, generalizing kidnappings, and a land which is now receiving recruits that Al-Qaeda or groups affiliated to Al-Qaeda make in Europe or in other areas of the world, and which are sent there as well as in the past were sent to Afghanistan
or Bosnia.
And now you have people recruited in France which end up as adolescents or youngsters fighting in Chechnya, or people recruited in Spain, which are transferred to Iraq for their training.
So what you're saying is, and please help me make sure I understand you, I think what you're making is a very important point. In your opinion, Iraq has become a laboratory for Al-Qaeda's techniques and a recruiting ground for its troops.
Yeah.
So it is a failure in those senses.
It is a failure because in the best of the possible scenarios, once the invasion took place and the occupation, I mean, the situation in Iraq is degrading and chaotic.
Degrading and chaotic.
And to say something different from this is to be far away from reality. So it's the kind of states disintegrated and lacking security that the terrorists really want to penetrate and eventually or partially control.
So you're saying around the world, in a sense, those states that are degraded, that are failing, become very attractive to terrorists as grounds for their action.
And until the present, the intervention has created one of these states which are highly at risk of becoming not a battleground against terrorism, but a ground where the terrorists grow and increase in numbers and capabilities.
Fernando, one of the things that's fascinated me as I've tried to understand this topic is this question. And now I turn to you not just as someone who's an expert on terrorism, but also as a professor of political science. Terrorism in and of itself, I think we would both agree, is essentially a tactic, or at least traditionally might have been a tactic. But is there a way in which it's becoming an ideology? That is to say, something in which greater growing numbers of people around the world can believe in as a kind of an end in itself? You know, like in the beginning, I talked about mere anarchy being loosed on the world. Is that?
No, I don't think so. Perhaps in Russia in 19th century you have these nihilists, which
anarchists,
were terrorists as well. But the current terrorists have an ideology which is that of Salafist jihadism. They have a purpose, and they are convinced that by making this kind of violence, they are engaged in a holy war in defense of Islam, and in the event they die in the process, they are convinced they will be rewarded in the other life. No, I don't think they commit violence for the sake of violence. I think they before joining the terrorist group, they had been fairly well, harshly indoctrinated.
Right. Because of that belief, Fernando, because you see this as in its way, a kind of a rational belief in a religious goal, rather than madness and anarchy, does that mean we're in for a very long struggle? We should view this as something that's going to be with us for quite a while?
I'm not denying that these terrorists are not acting out of emotions as well. Frustration or identity deprivation or hatred. Actually, hatred is part. Hatred with respect to the infidels.
Would you say hatred in a sense of humiliation by the infidels?
No, hatred facing the infidels and the Christians and the Jews, as they understand, is part of the Salafist ideario, part of the Salafist belief. So it's already incorporated into the motivations of the terrorists.
That's just deeply ingrained, and it's going to be very hard to root out.
I doubt this will be over. I doubt we will be able to control and end this terrorist wave before 15, 20 years.
15, 20 years at best. Well, as we do that, Fernando, I think we'll all agree that wisdom like yours will be very helpful. And the fact that you were able to come here today and give us a European perspective and help us understand how it's viewed from that continent and this. And I think you also emphasized the need for both Americans and Europeans to work together.
Well, indeed, we are all facing the same threat. Mm-hmm. It is very important for Americans not to think that September 11 was an act against the United States.
Right.
It took place in the United States. March 11th took place in Madrid, but was not an action against Europeans.
Right.
Both September 11th and March 11th are part of a terrorist campaign against the Western world, and we have to share this common perception.
Well, thank you very much for that, because I think that's exactly right. It's a war against all of us, and we have to all be together. Fernando, thank you once again.
Thank you very much to you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wwic.si.edu. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Network. Please join us again right here next week, and thanks for watching.
Next week on Dialogue.
On the other side, yes, there is this sentence of my former colleague saying, let's do it as you did it in the developed countries. Let's be rich at first and clean up later. Isn't that not necessary that we are also subsidizing our economic development by bringing cost to the environment as you did it in the developed nation as well? And we must prove that with regard to environment security, we are not blocking the developing process they urgently need. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we are always under the obligation to prove the win-win character. And where we want to have more also as a win-win for the globe, then we must be also aware that this must be financed together, that the resources are not charity, but these are investment for our common peaceful future.